Thank you for joining us at ZapConnect. Welcome to Code Steps 101, where we will be exploring the possibilities of the Code by Zapier app and how you can use it in your workflows. So my name is Erin Oz, and I'll be leading this workshop. I am a senior customer champion on the Premier team here at Zapier, supporting team and company users. I've also worked with the support engineering team as a reservist, and I've been mentored by some excellent Zapier engineers in learning JavaScript. And outside of work, I'm a professional French horn player, so when I'm not supporting Zapier users in the queue, you'll find me on a train somewhere heading to a gig, and I play in various freelance groups in New York City and with my brass quintet, Calliope Brass. So that explains what the big metal thing is in my photo. So on to the good stuff. What are we going to learn in the next 28 minutes? So first, we'll briefly discuss the basics of JSON, or JavaScript object notation. JSON is the format that Zapier uses to send and receive data. Next, we'll take a look at the code step action template in the Zapier editor. We'll cover the input data field, how it works, and how it interacts with the code field. These are the building blocks of a code step. As a side note, it is possible to use a code step as a trigger, but we're going to be focusing on actions today. So then we will see two Zaps that use a code step action to handle a data processing task. Finally, we'll cover some important limitations of code steps, and I'll share additional resources that will come in handy when creating your own code step. So before we dive into the code steps, it's important to understand how data in Zapier is formatted. So Zapier triggers and actions rely on HTTP requests, where one server calls another and requests or delivers information. So what is JSON? JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a lightweight format for storing and transporting data, and is often used when data is sent from one server to another. JSON is considered self-describing and easy to understand by humans, which, as a human, I find very appealing. You can think of JSON as a set of grammar rules. For example, imagine if I asked, "Week want shop you to the go do coffee to this." That question doesn't follow any syntax rules, and you as a listener likely perceived it as a nonsensical jumble of words. The English language has grammar rules that English speakers follow so we can understand each other. If I don't use an acceptable format, it's really hard to know what I'm asking. When I put the words in the correct format, I communicate the information in a way that other English speakers can understand. So, "Do you want to go to the coffee shop this week?" will result in delicious coffee instead of confused looks. Just like the rules of grammar, JSON is an accepted format for delivering information. The two components of JSON we'll look at today are objects and arrays. So what's an object? An object is an item that has properties listed in key value pairs. So for example, here's an object saved to a variable called speaker, and the name property is Erin. This structure shows us that there's more than one item, as well as more details about that specific item. And objects can have multiple properties, just like I have more qualities than my name. I also have a job as a customer champion, and I'm very clearly 103 years old. So now, what happens when objects come in groups? That's what we call an array. Thankfully, there's more than one customer champion working here at Zapier, otherwise I wouldn't have had time to create this presentation. So if I have a set of multiple customer champion objects saved to my speaker variable, I have an array of objects. In each object of the array, I can have the same set of properties or a slightly different set of properties. Arrays are surrounded by brackets, which we can see here, which tells us that there are multiple objects. So in Zapier, you may hear this referred to as line items, and that's generally referring to an array. Arrays behave in defined ways and can be manipulated by methods that are built into the JavaScript language. That's one of the use cases that we will see in just a few minutes. So now that we have a basic understanding of JSON objects and arrays, let's take a look at the code step inside the Zapier editor. When we refer to code steps, we're really talking about an app that's called Code by Zapier. Code by Zapier is an app that you can use in the Zapier editor as either a trigger or an action. Today we'll be focusing on code step actions, as I said before, and I'll be demonstrating using JavaScript. Triggers are a bit more tricky and aren't used as frequently, and so we'll save that for a 102 course at next year's ZapConnect. So code steps allow you to process data through snippets of code in either Python or JavaScript, as we will be working with today. In other words, any data that you're working with in your Zap can be processed or changed by a code step during your Zap's workflow. You'll need to program your code step to produce an output variable after it runs. The output variable can be a single object or an array of objects. The output can then be mapped into subsequent action steps in your Zap and used like any other data field. After you've selected a language in the app, you're going to see two fields, input data and code. You can see them here in our slide. Input data is called a dictionary variable, which basically means it acts as a glossary of defining the data that you'd like to use within the code. It isn't possible to directly map data from previous Zap steps into the code field, so we use the input data field as sort of an intermediary. You'll want to create a key value in input data for each field that you'd like to be able to use within the code. So the code field is where, you guessed it, you'll add the actual code. You can pull in the values from input data using the variable names that you defined. So for example, if you'd like to use an input data field called name within your code, as you see here, you can refer to it with dot notation and use input_data.name to call that value in your code. So to demonstrate how this works, let's run our very first code together. So you'll see a shared Zap link in the chat that you can use to follow along with the demo. All right, so if we open up our Zap here, we should see some code already in the trigger here. And you'll see that we're defining a variable speaker, and right here we have a sample name. And so for those following along, go ahead and change that to your name. So I'm going to type my name, Erin, in here. And then I'll click continue. And in order to make sure, I've run this several times. So what I'll do is I'll go in here and I'll click load more to make sure that what I'm seeing in the trigger sample is the most recent code that's been entered. So I'll load more, and that reruns the code, and I get the result that I'm looking for. And now we can go on to the action step. So when we come into the action step, what we'll see here is these two parts in the editor that we talked about: input data and code. So input data is basically the section where I can line up my keys and my values. I'm making a little glossary of the information that I'd like to be able to use in the code when I write that part. So the first thing I'll do is I'll set a variable here, and I'm going to name it something a little odd just to make sure that things are clear as we go on what's what. So I'm going to call this define name. So I'm defining the name, and then I'm going to map the name field from the trigger into the value space here. So what I've done is I have created a definition of, I have something called define name, and every time the Zap runs, the data from my trigger that's mapped here will be inserted into this value space. Now we get to the code part. So the first thing I'll do is create a variable within the code called name. And I'm going to set that variable to save what is in input data dot define name to that variable. So what I've done is I've taken the data from here and it's now saved to this variable in the code called name. And so now within the code, I can use the variable name to mean this, and I can work with that. So the next thing that I'll do is I'll create another variable called uppercase name. And this is where I'm going to save the uppercase version of the string that I brought into name. So in order to use this uppercase method that's built into vanilla JavaScript, if you just Google uppercase JavaScript, then you'll find this method. It's great. So the way that we do that is we take the variable that we want to perform the method on, and then we say dot, and then we say to uppercase parentheses semicolon. So what that does is now I've created a variable called uppercase name, and I saved the value of the result of this to that variable. So now that's all well and good, but now I want that to actually appear in the output of this code step. So the output of the code step needs to be an object or an array of objects. So in order to create my object, I'm going to use that curly brace. I'll say uppercase name, curly brace. So what I've done now is I've created an object that's going to have the value of what was saved here, or in other words, the uppercase transformed version of this, and that's what's going to be the output of my code step. So I'm going to hit continue, and then I'll test and review, and look at that. I have uppercase name, and now my name is in uppercase. So congratulations on writing your very first code step. So now that you've done a little bit of dabbling, let's take a look at two use cases where code steps can come in handy. Our first use case uses the JavaScript method filter to process an array of emails and only return emails that match the specified domain name. So let's say you're booking calls with potential clients and other employees at your company are present in the call. You'd like to send an email to the call attendees after the call ends, but only to internal employees. So in this example, we can take a set of event attendees and only include internal employees who have the company domain name in their email address using this filter method. So this code step looks at the array of email addresses and will return emails that match the search terms of the filter. A useful feature here is that if the code returns more than one result, the subsequent actions in the Zap will run on each result. So this is called forking. When your Zap forks, that means it splits and runs steps multiple times on a different item. So in other words, if you had a step 3 that sent an email would be sent to every address that matches the search. You'll find another shared Zap link in the chat right now. And so let's take a walk through this Zap and see how we can use the filter method to search for that specific domain name in this next demo. All right, so similar to our other Zap, this shared Zap has some code and things already in here. So we can see that I have a set of emails that are coming in from the test data. I have entered them into the input data and named that as define emails because I'm defining the emails and I'm very clever. So in the code here, first we create an array from the attendee email addresses because even though we have a list of emails here that are separated by a comma, it is not going to function as an array because what input data should we provide to your code as strings? This messes up quite a few folks. It's a little confusing. So no matter what is here, it's coming into the code as strings and it's going to behave like strings. Numbers will not act like numbers, they'll act like strings, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that we have to do in order to get this set of emails to behave like an array and to be able to use this method that we're using is first we're going to create a variable emails array that takes input data dot define emails and splits along the comma to create an array. So then our next step is to only return email addresses that include at Zapier.com. This can be changed to any domain by changing the red text. Obviously, I already changed it. We have Yahoo.com. So the important changeable thing here is the at whatever.com. So if we want to say at Zapier.com, we can look for all email addresses in this list that include at Zapier.com, and that's what this code here is doing. Filtered emails is set to this piece of code that looks for emails in the array that include at Zapier.com. And then here we add the email addresses to that output here. And so what this is going to do is give us a list of filtered emails in cases where there's more than one. And we can see that in the output because we see that there's array brackets signifying that there could be more than one. And then we have that object. So here we go. Let's see if it works. And we need to retest the action because obviously I ran it before and we're seeing the old result. Retest the action. And there we go. We have 2 items in that filtered emails variable. Both of these items include at Zapier.com. Now if we want to go back and try something else, just to double check, again, we can just change this red text here to, let's say, yahoo.com, because I know that there's a Yahoo email in that list. And I'll retest the action again. And now I get my single yahoo.com address. And so this code can be changed to any domain name that you'd like to return the results for. Our second use case handles full name fields with varying numbers of names. This original code solution was posted to the Zapier community by John Foreman from Metagrate, who is a certified Zapier expert. So this is a great example of how you can find a code solution in the Zapier community, and you can tweak it to suit your needs without needing to write code from scratch. So in the chat, you'll find a third shared Zap link that will bring you to a Zap with this code saved to it. Sometimes a trigger step will deliver a full name field, but the action that you'd like to send to requires first and last name to be sent separately. So it is possible to use a series of formatter steps to compensate for cases where a middle name is entered in the name field, but formatter isn't particularly flexible. So if a user enters 4 names, for instance, your formatter step will not accurately parse the first and last names as you would likely expect it to. So using a code step here allows you to program flexibility because the code can handle more than one case. Some people have 1 name, 2 names, some people have 5 names. So this code will return the first name, the last name, and group all names in between into a single field called middle name. So as an experiment in the shared Zap, try changing the input data full name field in the shared Zap to your own name. You can include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12 names, however many you'd like, and run the code to see how it handles each case. And we'll also take a look at how this works in our final demo. So in this code step, I have, again, my input data. I've named this full name, and I have some sample data that contains a full name that I programmed in the trigger, and you should see the same in your shared Zap. And so this code that John wrote goes through several steps, but again, this is a good example of you don't necessarily need to understand exactly what's going on in the code in order to be able to utilize it for what you're looking to do. So the brief overview is that he's creating the variables that we're going to use in the output. He's pulling in the full name from this input data field. So we have full name. and it's being processed a bit here. Then we have several cases that account for the different scenarios with the different numbers of names that are possible. And so again, you don't necessarily need to understand the full for loop that's happening here in order to be able to use the code, which is one of the great things about finding resources like this in the Zapier community. The big thing for you to understand is how the data gets from input data into the code. So for example, if you were to find this code somewhere and you weren't quite sure what variable name was used with input data, you know enough now that you could come in here and you could say, oh, okay, look, input data dot full name with a capital N. That's what the expectation is for where the data is coming from inside this code. So I can make sure that that matches. And then we come down to the bottom and we see that the output includes the first name, middle name, and last name variables. Now, say for some reason I didn't want the middle name. I now know enough that I can actually remove it from here. But first, let's experiment with what happens. So we'll retest our action. And here we see we get a first name, a middle name, and a last name that exactly matches what we're seeing in the sample data. Now, just for fun, I'm going to try doing 4 names. Let's see what happens. I'll run that again. And we can see that in the first name, we get the first name, the middle name, both of the middle names are in the middle name field, and the last name is still the single name, which is most often what we're looking to return when we're trying to process data like this. So now if we have a use case where, let's say I have, how many is that? 6 names. We're going to see the same result where the middle name field is going to contain everything that isn't first or last. Exactly. Because in most cases, what you're looking for to move into the next step is most often just the first and the last name. So this helps make sure that you're catching the first and the last name and not accidentally getting the middle name as a last name or something of that nature, which can happen when you're using formatter steps that don't have the flexibility for this type of processing. So now let's say I don't even want to see the middle name at all in the output. So I know enough now that I can come in here and I can just remove it altogether. And I know that now all I'm going to see is the first name, wait until I retest it, and the last name. And I won't even see the middle name field returned. And in some cases, that might be what you're looking for. And so, again, the nice thing about this is that now that we've identified sort of the parts here, the components, when working with code that someone else has created that you find in Zapier community or on Stack Overflow or places like this, you can manipulate code that already exists without necessarily needing to be able to have written it from scratch. So as you begin to create your own code, you may find yourself running into the limitations of code steps. So I've added 2 slides with links to articles that can help resolve some common issues folks run into when creating code steps here. So this slideshow will be available after the session, so you can access all of the links and the pre-recorded demos at your leisure. So some quick things to point out. Code steps can be run in vanilla Python or vanilla JavaScript. The code needs to be short enough to run in less than 10 seconds, and it cannot call external libraries using tools like NPM or anything like that. If you'd like to make an HTTP request in your code step, you can use a built-in HTTP client in your step. There's also utilities for logging and for storing or retrieving data. These are more advanced features of code steps that you might want to use once you get the hang of it. 2 other articles that I'd like to highlight here are from Zapier community and the Zapier blog. The first article is how to set default values in code steps, which can help you avoid errors for missing values in cases where that might become a problem. And another article from the Zapier blog, When to Use the Developer Platform. This article outlines the limitations and sort of when you're outgrowing a code step and it might be time to build a private app on the Zapier Developer Platform. And finally, a final plug for the Zapier community Code and Webhooks forum. This is a great place to post questions, find inspiration for your workflows, and get insights from Zapier certified experts. So to wrap things up, thank you so much for joining me to learn more about code steps, and I hope you learned something new in the session. Please feel free to post any additional questions you have in the Zapier community under that Code and Webhooks forum that I shared here and is also shared in the chat. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.